This is a continuation of another story called Squidward's Suicide. You must first watch the first video so that you won't get confused with this version. This version is called Red Mist. It is a controversial real-life bootleg tape featuring an unaired episode of the popular Nickelodeon series Spongebob SquarePants. Like the long-lost yet recently discovered Suicide Mouse tape, Red Mist was purportedly created by a now-imprisoned Scottish animator for the series who intended to pass the tape off as the Season 4 premiere episode instead of Fear of a Krabby Patty, and features the death of Squidward. Red Mist begins with Squidward preparing to practice his clarinet in his room as SpongeBob and Patrick play merrily outside. Squidward wraps his mouth around the clarinet and is only able to play one note before being interrupted by someone knocking on the door. He walks down and opens the door and discovers that a traveling salesman is at his door. The salesman, a Scottish fish, asks if he could have a moment of Squidward's time. Squidward tells him that he isn't interested and slams the door in the man's face. Walking back to his room, the salesman begins knocking again, and Squidward opens the door angrily. The salesman looks very upset, telling Squidward that the red mist is coming, and proceeds to walk off, confusing Squidward. Squidward walks back to his room and finally begins to play the clarinet. After performing several off-key notes, SpongeBob and Patrick begin laughing outside, interrupting Squidward yet again. Squidward walks over to the window and shouts at the two, telling them he needs to practice for a concert he will be performing at. SpongeBob and Patrick both apologize tearfully and walk back to their respective homes. Squidward, unsure of himself, walks back and begins playing his clarinet again, this time uninterrupted. The scene then fades to red over the course of 12 seconds, and perhaps by glitch, the same scene is repeated once more, which is somewhat common in rough cuts of animation. However, this time, Squidward's eyes have been replaced with new and more realistic eyes with red pupils. Clearly not real, but more realistic than CGI, TV, or animated. The audio is also completely absent from this scene, save for occasional clicks. After the repeat of the previous scene, a new scene begins with the same red eyes, but at the theater where Squidward is playing his clarinet. The frames in the animation skip every 4 seconds, but the second remains synced. After an unruly performance of a song he dubbed Red Mist, SpongeBob and Patrick are seen in the crowd booing Squidward, very uncommon for them. The scene pans to reveal the same Scottish salesman sitting next to him, also booing. As Squidward walks back to his home, the salesman, with his head in his tentacles. What's odd is that the scene actually shows him walking to his house, with nothing happening in the background for 3 minutes and 50 seconds before abruptly cutting to red for another 20 seconds, just as he arrives at his house. A new scene appears back to the original cartoon eyes, with Squidward sitting in a chair in his room that night, with a blank look on his face for roughly 30 seconds before starting to sob softly. Again, the audio is completely missing for most of the scene, until the sobbing begins. This is when the sound of a slight breeze through a forest can be heard in the background. It also begins very mildly zooming in on Squidward's face, only noticeable if you compare 10 seconds of frames side by side. The sound of him sobbing can suddenly be heard, very loudly and severe as the screen twitches in on itself briefly. The salesman laughing can also be heard echoing in the background. After another 30 seconds, the screen blurs and twitches violently, and a single frame flashes over the screen. Upon pausing, pausing it exactly on the frame, the viewer can see a real-life photo of a deceased 6-year-old old boy laying in the forest in his underwear, whose face has been mangled, eye has been popped, and stomach cut open with entrails laying beside him. Next to him, the shadow of the photographer is clearly visible, with part of the photographer's hand appearing to the right of the screen. After this photograph is seen, it cuts back to Squidward sobbing, much louder than before, with what appears to be blood running from his eyes instead of tears, and the sound of the salesman still heard. The sound of the wind in the forest is also played at a much louder volume, but now with the sound of branches snapping and the screams of a young boy heard. After 20 more seconds, another single frame appears, this time of an 8-year-old girl in the forest, laying on her stomach in a pool of blood, with her back cut open and entrails piled on top. The shadow of the photographer is also visible. The scene reverts back to Squidward, now with the same realistic red eyes from before, completely silent and no longer sobbing. The sound of the forest can no longer be heard. Another 3 seconds later, and it cuts back to the sobbing, this time piercing loud and with the sound of the forest heard. The screams of both a boy and a girl can be heard mixed together as the song Amazing Grace plays on both the clarinet and the bagpipes. During this, 7 frames are seen in black and white of the boy from the first photograph, laying in the woods. Over the course of the 7 frames, the hand of the photographer reaches in and grabs the boy's entrails. As his remaining eye focuses on the man's hand and even blinks once, it cuts back to Squidward again, this time staring at the viewer as the sound of the salesman echoes, "Do it!" and the red mist is coming repeatedly. After 40 seconds of this, the camera quickly pans out to reveal Squidward holding a realistic gun, looking as though if it were photoshopped into the scene. Squidward lifts the barrel into his mouth and fires, with blood shooting out from his head.